what PittMoss is so the listeners can understand. It's based on paper and cardboard that has been fiberized. That lignocellulosic fiber that's in paper and the cardboard is then fiberized, and then it's re-agglomerated into particles.
At the beginning of the year, you fluff up your soil, you till it, whatever that looks like to a gardener. It's fluffy. And then halfway through your grow, most of the time your soil is totally compact. And I'm always wondering why would it get compact if you're not standing on there, you're not walking on it? Why does it become compact? I'm asking this question more to as better understanding. Do you guys use gypsum in your process to make PittMoss?
A lot of people don't realize that the carbon dioxide in the air is maintained mostly by the ocean. 73% of the earth is covered with salt-containing ocean.
Are you having drybacks and issues with your media? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about one media you can add to your soil with Charles Becky from PittMoss. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Make sure to check us out on Instagram and Facebook. We got our $2.99 membership and a VIP link down in the description if you need more one-on-one. Once again, please hit the notification button so you can get updates when we release great content like this in the future. Let's go and get into it, guys. Just like our last call, I've fallen in love with your product for so many reasons, from a lot of growers, especially when they're growing with, and I'll let you just take over the meeting of just kind of throwing in a couple seeds before we start. A lot of growers, they run into phosphorus and potassium excess normally midway through their grow, especially if they're growing with pots, just because of inconsistent watering practices. But what it really comes down to is when the roots get larger, it chokes off that pot. It really doesn't matter what size they're growing in, and salts begin to dry up around those dry pockets. And then at some point, they water and the salt becomes soluble. And because phosphorus and potassium are so easily taken up, it goes from a deficiency to a toxicity, almost immediately. And that seems to just be the classic thing every year. And some of the reasons why I just love your product is because even if you walk away from your garden, that PittMoss is going to be retaining water. It's going to be holding on to something. And it just creates a much more consistent rhizosphere in a consistent watering practice. And I found that the growers that use your product and use it part of their media seem to run into that problem a lot less than 90% of the industry. And yeah, and that was just one of the things that I wanted to mention on this one, as well as dive into whatever topic you wanted to talk about around PittMoss.
Well, that's good. PittMoss is unique. It's an attempt to mimic what happens in nature. At the bottom of the forest, you have all kinds of leaves and things that slowly decay. It creates a kind of a tuft. And if you ever dug around in the forest, you realize there's an awful lot of roots right underneath those leaves and in that first surface layer. And that organic matter really helps. The lignin and cellulose from the leaves really help to maintain the nutrient balance. So the thing you're talking about possibility of excess salts, excess potassium, excess phosphorus developing is, normally the result of a couple of things. One is you're trying to correct a problem that exists as you're growing by putting on all the phosphorus and all the potassium, and some of the components you put in there maybe are reserves of phosphorus and potassium. And then, like you say, when it dries down and etc., that phosphorus and that potassium is not in a complex, in an organic complex. It's sitting there and is very dependent on the water and the water density, the amount of water and moisture that's available to the roots. You dry down a little bit and the concentration increases, and then you have a short-term burst or excess. Whereas with PittMoss, the lignocellulose by its structure represents or mimics somewhat that lower layer of the forest tuft, underneath the trees, etc. And so it complexes a lot of that material in a loosely held cation exchange, if you will. Loosely held in that it's there. It can be pulled out by the roots when they're in direct contact, can be pulled out by the microbes, etc. So, good organic matter helps a lot in those salt variations, the high soluble salt, low soluble salts. And some of that organic matter will, by the time you get later in the crop, not be in very good shape. So that's one of the interesting things that PittMoss does. It also holds the nutrients. And so just a little bit to talk about what PittMoss is so the listeners can understand. It's based on paper and cardboard that has been fiberized, that lignocellulosic fiber that's in paper and the cardboard is then fiberized, and then it's re-agglomerated into particles. Now, in those particles, we have the internal pore space and we have the external structure. The internal pore space holds the water and to some degree more and more air as the material dries. And the external structure gives you spaces between the particles in your mix, your substrate. When you use PittMoss, you end up with more airspace and more water holding, and that's kind of hard for people to grasp. But what you do is you use the space in the substrate better because you've got that space.
That's because when you recycle that paper, it creates more, and you make it a fiber, it creates more surface area that's exposed, correct?
Correct. Yeah. If you took a fiber, it's kind of like creating yarn balls, if you will, but you've got all that little space both between and within the yarn and between the different yarn balls that might be there. And so then because of how we re-engineer it to make those particles, now they're not necessarily always round, they're different shapes, but they still end up with this internal, external pore space. So that also then helps you, because the roots can penetrate that. You don't need to build the really high nutrient ratio. And the other thing that's interesting is a lot of growers are familiar with cation exchange. And cation exchange is the positive charges, sort of like electrostatic or magnetic charges, but it's used primarily to identify the qualities and characteristics of clay soils and mineral soils. However, organic matter doesn't have a really positive or negative charge that's the same as clay. Clay has a structure that gives you a positive charge in one spot, a negative charge in another spot. So where organics is kind of like a network. So you can create a network of organic materials that'll give you a generally positive condition or a generally negative condition. And most people are familiar with chelating or sequestering, where things are collected in and around what they call a claw. A claw is really a term for chelating, and that claw holds on to that mineral. Well, with organic substances, that happens some, but it kind of wraps around it. In many cases, the minerals are attracted. There's both positive and negative charges, so you have both positive and negative sites. And that's why in your question about phosphorus and potassium, phosphorus, if it's in excess, will then cling to the PittMoss, and where it has positive charges or generally a positive area, and it'll hang in there. And then the cations, the potassium, which is positively charged, will find an area in the lignocellulosic matrix that will cling to where there's a negative charge there. And so it's held sort of like magnetism in there. So that prevents it from coming out, especially when it gets drier, it gets held more tightly. So instead of being looser and more available, it's more tight, and then it's not a damaging characteristic to the roots of the plant.
While staying in a water-soluble form, because the PittMoss retains the water.
Say that again.
While staying in a water-soluble form, because the PittMoss is holding on to water, so it doesn't crystallize.
Right. It is not crystallized. However, it is water-soluble to a degree. And again, think of if you have a dust on a magnet, like an iron dust on a magnet, you will have that held there and it'll be available, but it's not necessarily a mineral that's crystallized and dissolving into the water. It is available. And then there's the mass action, where if you have a lot of, just for example here, potassium in this solution, you'll have more of it then cling to the PittMoss. And there's various degrees of attraction. So if you have a lot of potassium, then it'll be attracted and held to a varying degree. If you have a lot of it, there'll be more clinging to the PittMoss. And then if you have a little bit of it, you'll have still some clinging, but not as much. So it's kind of like a variable absorbent.
It really sounds like this is silica to trace minerals. Like if there's excess, to my understanding, if there's excess trace minerals, silica holds on to those trace minerals so it doesn't become toxic to the environment until it's ready to be released. So exactly also like a cation exchange site as well. That's fascinating.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's sort of like the silica forms a complex molecular structure and a complex semi-salt, if you will, often. And so there's a lot of similar reactions. It's halfway between organic matter and clay and how it behaves. So yeah, the other part about pit moss that's really significant is these pores that hold water to varying degrees. One of the things that you will see when you use pit moss, as opposed to even sphagnum peat, or I guess a really good example would be biochar. Biochar holds some water, or bark holds some water, but then when it drops down, it all of a sudden will hit what I call a climacteric. Well, it drops off really fast in its available water. So it goes from a good supply of water to just really low water availability. Whereas pit moss has a slow, steady drop off, so that when you get near wilt point in a plant, there's still quite a bit of water available. And when the plant gets stressed, it'll be able to pull some of that water off in a slowly progressing, more limited supply of water, but it still can get some water. Whereas with some of the materials, especially clay, biochar, they just drop off quite readily. And really coarse sphagnum will do that too.
Yeah, we got the cocoa, the sphagnum peat moss, we have the biochar. These are all various medias that people talk around surface area and holding different minerals. And just kind of as you're talking from our previous conversation, I had added around 5% of my media pit moss, and you recommended, you're like, well, it can hold actually up to 30%. And I was like, I don't know, that seems like it's going to hold on to a lot of water. But throughout my entire grow, I actually was like, you know what, next year I think I'm going to add like another 15-20% pit moss, just because it seemed that during my grow, I wanted more of it. And I had this like inkling in my heart. I was like, man, because I mean, massive, 20 foot, not 20, but well, if you think about it, it went up 6 feet, looped over another 6 feet. My tomato plants were at least 12, 13 feet tall this year. And midday through, you could see the drooping happening on the top of the leaves. And I was just like begging for more water, or a higher retention of water, especially in the higher altitudes. And especially as you're talking about now too, because we're dealing with a massive problem of over fertilization in the industry because of marketing. And it sounds like pit moss would be a great regulator to that. Like it would be like a safety net to people that are over fertilizing as well, possibly.
Yeah. One of the things you have to remember is that it holds more water, and it also retains the nutrients against runoff and other things. So you can still build up excess of fertilizer. It takes about twice as much almost fertilizer to create burn and damage and that sort of thing in pit moss, because of its ability to retain that much more water. And I'm going to use the term cation exchange loosely, because cation exchange is usually a measure of the quantity of nutrients that can be held. However, in this case, it's just a general nutrient buffering in total. And the interesting thing, it holds the nutrients against leaching, just because it holds it just sufficiently enough that you can water. And when you get rains and other things, it doesn't flush it all out. But just as the amount of pit moss you can tolerate is dependent on kind of some of the other materials you have in relationship to it. You don't want to damage the airspace too much. Now, pit moss tends to increase the airspace unless you have a lot of really fine, low particle size materials, small, really fine materials that'll intersperse between them, like clays, like some of the yeah, well, fine sand is not so good, but coarse sand will do. You want to have enough porosity in there. And so I worked for several years in a retail greenhouse just a couple of years ago till I had some health problems. And I was able to grow effectively in 60% pit moss. And I had to have about 15% perlite in that situation with the sphagnum I was using. The sphagnum I was using was kind of a brown, highly decayed, darker sphagnum. But so I was able to use 60% pit moss, 25% sphagnum, 15% perlite, gave us resilience against over compacting, and phenomenal crops, phenomenal results. And of course, things like hanging baskets and things that are big container pots that are exposed to all the weather would give great shelf life for the plants in the consumer's yard, the homeowner would loved it, and many would go on vacation or take a long weekend, come back, and they'd be great. And then the guy down the road that had, or the Home Depot or whatever, wherever they bought it, had a lot of other materials, especially bark and some wood fiber, and that really reduced the amount of available water. Therefore, the shelf life was poor. You got to remember that too much water exists only is almost a misnomer. A lack of oxygen is the real issue. And so if you have that fluffy characteristic where you have porosity at saturation, you got enough gas exchange, then you can hold a lot of water as long as there's gas exchange. So
that was another thing I noticed this grow was I've heard this many times that you add carbon to soil so that you can lose it. And I've heard a number of people say that. And this year when we obviously when I started the soil, I could definitely see the root systems, like I don't want to call it compact the soil. I saw the root system just want to suck the soil tight, if that makes sense. Like it felt like that this season. And just to kind of explain that a little bit better, at the beginning of the year, you fluff up your soil, you till it, whatever that looks like to a gardener. It's fluffy. And then halfway through your grow, most of the time your soil is totally compact. And I'm always wondering why would it get compact if you're not standing on there, you're not walking on it? Why does it become compact? And over the years, I've realized that like it's because in my mind that the roots are just sucking all the nutrients and the water constantly out of it, and it's like drawing it down, or it's taking up that carbon. But with the PittMoss, I put my hand on that soil at the end of the season. It looks compact, but it's not compact. Still pretty spongy. And
right. Yeah, it maintains a springing action. It depends on the nature of the components that you put in the blend, how they give up their carbon and how they compact. Compaction is usually a result of intermingling of fine particles and drift and shifting of the fine particles into the large pore space. The knitted characteristic of PittMoss, kind of a knitted when the reagglomerated particles, kind of reduce that probability where a lot of material, if you were to just take the fibers in PittMoss themselves and stir it into a mix, you would probably see it compact more. But because of the fiber structure, you get some consumption of that carbon. You know, the microbiome, the rhizosphere, right around the roots, there's all this microbial action that is constantly decaying or using the carbon that's there. But you have to remember that that is also replaced by the root structure itself. And so if the root structure goes into the particles, it creates a knitting of its own. And then if the PittMoss isn't decaying too much to where it shifts and fills in all the pores, the two work together to form a good knitting structure. And I've seen this all the time where you get a little bit of compaction, and usually that's the result of not compacting it sufficiently or pressing it in. You can get a really high fluffing action or expansion action. For example, if you put 1 cubic foot of PittMoss in with some other blend, you will end up with it actually increasing to about 1.25 cubic feet in that blend because of the loftiness and the fluffiness that it creates. However, that really needs to be packed back down when you put in your plants, because that will settle out with watering and growing. When you have some of the carbon of the fiber structure being consumed in that little fuzzball of PittMoss, you don't consume the whole fuzzball. You only consume some of it, a little bit of it, the most readily available, the edges of it. And so it still is pretty solid. If you tear that apart and look really closely under a microscope, you'll see it's some decay, some use of that carbon, but it's still a lot of good structure remaining. If that makes any sense.
It does. No, it does. When you talk, I kind of like shut off of parts of my brain and just listen. And when you listen to a person allow the full story to come out, you're like, oh, interesting.
Yeah, well, you know, I've been in soils since I was 8 years old, and we worked with a lot of different materials. So when I had the opportunity to work with PittMoss and the people that originally invented it, I said, this is awesome because we can structure the physical structure of it to where it's going to be a pretty nifty material rather than creating little hard chunks or something like that with no internal porosity. We we have that opportunity.
You mentioned perlite. Does PittMoss help keep perlite in the media, or do you still see perlite float to the top? Because over the years, I've told growers to just get away from it because you put it in, it just floats to the top every time, it seems like. And will it actually help keep the perlite within the media and in the media?
Yeah, somewhat. If you take and shake a can of nuts, the bigger nuts always shaken up to the top. And little by little, agitation of the media and movement of the media causes the bigger particles to come up to the top. And perlite is, of course, low density as well, so it can kind of come up to the top and shift. Whereas the PittMoss, with its kind of a fuzzy structure and everything, tends to knit things together. They don't move as much. So that's what we see. And there's all kinds of formulas and blends people use. We had a guy, he's got wood fiber, rice hulls, sphagnum peat, and PittMoss, and it's probably really one of the niftiest mixes I've seen because of just its structure. The rice hulls give him enough resilience to keep it from over compacting and all of that, but it's very stable. It doesn't change at all.
What is that media comprised of exactly? Do you know the percentages?
Well, let's see. Yeah, I kind of do. It would be just logical to express it 20, 25. Well, let me say this. They adjust the rice hulls if they want something to have less water holding for some reason. So their main base is 25% PittMoss, 25% rice hulls, and then I'm trying to remember exactly, 30% sphagnum and 20% wood fiber.
Oh.
So that's where they start from, and then they vary each of those. If they want less water holding, they put in more wood fiber and more rice hulls. If they want more water holding, they back those down.
What's their crop that they're growing?
Oh, they grow a wide array of ornamental flowers and perennials and vegetable transplants. But by the structure, I can tell it would be also excellent in large, deep pots. If you want a cannabis in a 5-gallon or a tomato in a 5 or 7-gallon, by its structure, I can tell that it would be a very good relationship. The idea is to get to the combination that you want to manage. And one of the things that for a lot of homeowners and gardeners of all sorts is that you want that plant in that. If it's in a container, you grew in container gardening or raised bed gardening, you want it to maintain it moisture for a good period of time, so you don't have to tend to it too much in the high stress and heat times. So anyway.
I've been recommending a lot of mushroom growers to try out PittMoss, just because it seems to retain water much better than vermiculite. What do you think about that? Can you give any recommendations or guidance around mushroom growing?
Well, it's surprising and interesting you should ask. I spent Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday in the mushroom capital of the world at a mushroom growing conference. We do sell a lot of PittMoss to the mushroom industry. They are using more and more of it, 25% in their some of their casing mix and some of the other applications. It really, depends on what mushrooms you're growing. Agaricus bisporus, the button mushroom, they like to use it in the casing layer. It's a couple of features, of course, is it holds a good supply of water. It can hold, depending upon what you do, you can make it hold more water than you want. So it works very well. You've got all the carbon and especially the lignin. Mushrooms really like lignin, and that's, a lot of the wood carbon that comes in, and they really thrive on that. The mycelium develop well in that. And so we're working with them and incorporating more and more PittMoss into the mushroom industry because, of course, sphagnum is getting more rare and expensive, and it's better environmental stewardship. So we're excited about that.
I mean, you've probably heard of all the dams pretty much worldwide at this point are drying up. I've always been told since I was a little kid that the sediment buildup was going to always be a problem. So no matter what, dams would need to be replaced, taken down, and re-put back up in other locations. Although, seeing the drought, I've been heavily recommending growers to incorporate this product just for drought resistance and the less water usage in general.
Right. We had a California cannabis grower who came back to us, and his first year working with PittMoss, Of course, in California, this area was dry, a lot of dry air. It wasn't on the coast, but kind of middle of the state. And he said that he thought he used 1/3 to 1/2 the water in growing his crop.
That was me too this year. 1,600 gallons of soil, only 5% PittMoss. I threw 1,600 gallons of soil. I grew 200 plants. I mean, you saw my garden. You saw that garden.
Yeah, yeah.
It was, I think, because I have a water meter, I ended up throughout the entire grow, and this was 5 months, I used just under 6,000 gallons of water. In my experience throughout the past few years, I would have to sit there and water, and with this one, I was literally it would take me about 17, 18 minutes to water all 1,600 gallons of water every morning. And I mean, it sounds like I'm using a lot of water with 6,000 gallons of water, but in 1,600 gallons of soil, it just felt like I used half the amount of water I would normally use every year.
Well, yes, we're seeing that all the time. A lot of the substrates and blends people use really require leaching. They require water to flow through to keep the nutrient balance the way they want it, and et cetera. One of the things that happens with PittMoss is you have to learn to tone down your nutrient applications. You can do it in the beginning and then back down so you don't have to leach all the time. And then secondly, the water is held within that substrate, and there's a mulch that it's a curious thing. And this is where the California guys were talking. And we had one project where they put it around, forget what kind of a fruit tree it was, but they mulched the fruit trees, and they had phenomenal results because of the mulching action, where the very surface of the PittMoss dried up and then mulched the base, so you didn't have all the evaporation that caused it to go out into the air. So it was a good thing, and I can see where it would help. Probably you have a real variability of humidity there where you grow. Sometimes it's very humid, and other times it's just probably almost bone dry. That brings to mind a really curious thing that I read not so long ago about the stability and mental health of people, and people who do outdoor sports, outdoor gardening, and work outdoors are essentially non-existent in the prisons. They essentially don't find, I guess, their satisfaction in other things. They learn how to recognize their connection with the world, etc. And to involve young people in gardening is probably the best thing you can possibly do for their mental health. Moving along on the how the substrates, one of the things about it you always want to keep in mind is there are really 5 aspects that I like to emphasize. And now it's become more important than ever to look at how the environmental impact of what we do with soils relates to the rest of, all of the natural systems, and whether we have runoff or anything. I was talking with a gentleman this morning from central Virginia. He lives in the mountains, and he's got this most beautiful river right next to him. And he had a couple of bald eagles nesting right across the river from his nursery, and it's a big nursery. But we talked about the runoff that comes from his nursery into that river, and how he's doing various things to avoid that and prevent it from happening. So the environment is one thing about substrates. The second thing that we look at is, of course, that you got to develop good physical properties, so it does the very things that we've been talking about. And then the chemistry we adjust. The chemistry can't be invasive. It has to have good pH, EC, nutrient balance, no toxic materials, clean and good. And then biologically, we want to foster good biology. And if we got good gas exchange and air porosity, good carbon sources, etc., and we don't end up creating an anaerobic environment, we can create good biology. If we can keep good gas exchange and oxygen there, the biology will help us a lot. And then the fifth thing that we talk about in soils is you want it to be aesthetically desirable. You don't want to have to be digging or pounding at it or trying to soften it all the time, or you don't want it to have a lot of odor, or just also put your hands in it. It feels good. It's nice to work with, etc. So those are the things about substrates you want to do. And when you're making your mix, as you said, you like the way it feels. You like the way it works in it. And we feel like PittMoss, I'm going to say about 1/3 in the mix, really gives a phenomenal characteristic to the mix in its various properties. But, there's different things. There's different, it's not the only thing that'll work, but it's one of the things that works well.
I had a grower this year. I'm asking this question more to as better understanding. Do you guys use gypsum in your process to make pit moss?
Yes. Gypsum is an integral part of what we do. It adds some good characteristics. One of the things that it does do, though, is it adds quite a bit of sulfur. Calcium sulfate makes up gypsum, but it also, the double charge on the calcium helps to maintain the structure of the substrate. So it's a big part of the methods that we use.
I'm a big proponent of calcium and sulfur, so I don't see any negatives to that. But could there be any negatives to that the growers or anyone should know of when growing it? Is there something like they should do less of, something else, or anything like that?
Well, fairly high level of calcium is there, but it's pretty hard to overdo calcium. But sulfur, it's hard to overdo that as well, but it can interfere. Form the sulfates, SO4, the oxygen form of sulfur, is a negatively charged anion, and those anions then can compete for the interaction with the substrates and other things, and you can end up building excess sulfur. So it's wise to avoid materials that are high in sulfur to go along with with the pit moss. Pit moss is generally high in sulfur. It'll be moderate in calcium, but high in sulfur. So that then also creates a bit of a problem. If you don't maintain the good structure, you actually end up with a substrate that's saturated and anaerobic, and you can make, say, like a bag of pit moss and keep it really wet. That sulfur then has a beautiful stench that comes out of it when it's anaerobic because of all the sulfur. So that's one of the considerations. But right now we consider gypsum as one of our components. We try not to advertise that or promote it because it just works with our product. It doesn't mean that all products should have a lot of gypsum, but our product does. So
No, that makes a lot of sense.
But the calcium is also one of the things that most people fail in having sufficient soluble calcium. That there needs to be, not limestone can provide some calcium, but it's not always soluble, whereas the gypsum tends to be moderately soluble, and you can get more available calcium for large plants. And anything that has a lot of stem structure to it, when it dies, you end up with a lot of fiber after it dies and shrinks and dries up, then it takes a lot of calcium.
Limestone's calcium carbonate, correct?
Yes, yeah.
So it's going to change the pH of your soil.
That's right.
And the calcium sulfate, the gypsum, is going to keep your pH. It's just not going to mess with it because it's already been oxidized. Is that
it? Generally keeps the balance of pH about the same. There's a slight acidifying effect of gypsum, and if you had gypsum all by itself in distilled water with no other materials around it, it would have a pH of 4.8. But when it's in a matrix with other things, it pretty much doesn't influence the pH at all.
This, just to dive a little bit more around that, one of the greatest issues I have found with backyard growers is that they're using the chlorinated water that comes out of their tap water to water their plants. And a lot of times the city water is high in sodium. And so I was thinking that the calcium sulfate would be a good proponent for people because it's actually helping to regulate the sodium out of the environment. Is that correct?
That's correct. The gypsum is used worldwide as a correction to sodic soils that are loaded with sodium. And like the Nile River Basin in that area is a big problem. What they have, what they call them saline sodic soils. They're high salts. That's what's with the saline, sodic being the sodium. And so there's all kinds of treatments with gypsum. Gypsum does slightly even increase the soluble salts, but plants need a balance of potassium and calcium, and sodium just clogs the works. It's a trash. It's in the way. And sodium is a more aggressive ion than calcium, magnesium, or even potassium. The cations, calcium, magnesium, and potassium have to be in a good ratio. When you throw sodium in the mix, you end up with pollution in there, and it causes imbalances to develop. Being that sodium is so aggressive and will cling to cation exchange and all of that, you really want to avoid the sodium. Now, in the Midwest, in a lot of the world, we don't have much sodium in the groundwater and so on, but I did have a project where we worked with a grower in Colorado, and he had a pond, and his pond was runoff water from the creek, and the creek was runoff water from the streets near in the city right adjacent to him, and his pond had sodium buildup that was quite significant, and it was creating a problem. So he was a lot of water. And when I went to see his operation, you could just see the irrigation pattern where a lot of water went through the crop, because the crop that he had, the crops in this greenhouse, were leached out. Where there was a lot of water, they did much better, and where there was less water, they were not thriving well. So you have to watch out about the water supply. You should get good water analysis. And then if you do get a good irrigation analysis, there's something you can ask for, and that's the sodium absorption ratio. It's called SAR, sodium absorption ratio. And that is used like out west, where they do a lot of irrigation with water that's not always the best, but they will look at that ratio, and they create, it's an equation they work with, and it's a little complex, but they can tell you if that ratio is 2 or less, it's a good product, good water. But if it's 2 or more, it's not so good. And if it's like, I think it's 5 or 6 or more, you shouldn't use it at all. So you want to keep in mind the sodium that's there. City waters typically don't have too much sodium, but the softening, water softeners, that's what you do when you soften your water, typically, is put sodium in there. That's not a good one.
You mentioned one other thing too that I thought was a little interesting. Sulfur is the strongest acid in the world, correct?
No. Nitric acid is actually more aggressive and stronger than sulfuric acid, but you don't typically see sulfuric acid is close. And then the even more stronger acids are hydrofluoric acid, which that's what they use for etching things like glass and things, that because it'll dissolve that. So there are a few acids that are stronger, but they're not commonly available.
I should have probably said the strongest naturally occurring acid.
Well, yeah, that's a little hard to say, because there are places like Tanzania and stuff like that. I've seen pictures of acid lakes that are not necessarily sulfur, but yeah.
No, actually,
but as a routine,
right.
You're right. Sulfuric acid is a very strong acid. Phosphoric is a little less damaging and strong. And I don't know if you ever read I think it's Pepsi that has phosphoric acid in it.
And also that lake you brought up, is that the lake where if living organic matter falls into it, it gets petrified within a year?
Well, there's several, but yeah, that's the kind of thing that happens. Yes.
That's very interesting.
Those are natural, because of the natural mineral deposits around it. The water then dissolves those minerals and creates the acids.
The reason why I was asking was, in my mind, how I've explained it for many years, and please correct me on this, and so I get better language around it. I found that a lot of the fertilizers in bottles, like if you turn it in the back of the bottle, they'll tell you 3 or 4 different nitrogens they're putting in there. And how I've always kind of read it is that they're telling you how many incomplete chemical reactions of nitrogen that are in the bottle. They're not telling you how much nitrogen's in it, but they're telling you, oh, there's 4 different types of nitrogen that aren't really totally the complete chemical reactions. And when I look at calcium sulfur, it's like the sulfur is helping to complete those chemical reactions by making them more acidic, or helping to adjust those bonds or tear them apart and readjust them. Is that a good way to look at that, or not?
Well, I think it's a fair way. There are chemical reactions that work to create insoluble nutrients that are not available to the plant. They form a rock, like a rock phosphate, that's slowly available rather than readily available. One of the best examples of that is if you take calcium nitrate and potassium sulfate. They're both minerals that are typically used in fertilizer. Potassium sulfate can be mined, and calcium nitrate is usually manufactured. If you mix those together at fairly high concentrations in the same bottle, for example, that's why you end up with bottles A and B. You really shouldn't mix those kinds of things, because the potassium reacts with the nitrate and the calcium nitrate to create potassium nitrate, which is soluble. The calcium, however, creates calcium sulfate, which is gypsum type material, settles out as a mud on the bottom of the container and is only slowly or minimally soluble. So you take away the solubility of the calcium and the sulfate, but you still have the potassium and the nitrogen as soluble. So that's why you end up with fertilizers A and B and a lot of those formulas. Now, if you have dry mineral fertilizers, you can mix those together, but as soon as you put them in water, they start to react. And you can create a sludge in the bottom, which would be a different rock form of a mineral that would create an insoluble nutrient. And it's incidentally, one of the very important minerals that's a rock, of course, is limestone. Also, there's sodium carbonate, potassium carbonate. A lot of people don't realize that the carbon dioxide in the air is maintained mostly by the ocean. 73% of the earth is covered with salt containing ocean, and the calcium, magnesium, and potassium and sodium in the water react with the carbon dioxide in the air to buffer it and keep it at a reasonable level. So in my mind, you could use all the carbon that there is in the earth and put it into the air, and eventually the ocean will settle it back out. There was a time when the carbon dioxide in the air was over 1,200 parts per million on the earth, but that, of course, the bottom of the ocean is covered with limestone and other sodium and potassium bicarbonate. So that's how they crystallize them, the minerals form.
You've answered all my questions today of why PittMoss is so amazing. I'm like, why is this product so good? And you've really have answered out, a lot of reasons. I noticed the difference in my garden this year with it.
Well, the unique property of the undecayed organic matter is good. There's decayed organic matter that's good as well. As an example, you've got the fulvic acid, humic acid, and the humates and humus all have good properties, but this is on the way toward humus and fulvic acid and humic acid. So as it operates in your substrate, you also are creating those materials which are beneficial as well.
That's very interesting.
It's a
precursor. It's a precursor.
Right, exactly. And the key is the fine fiber structure that allows that to happen. Now, again, it's not the best thing in every situation and every opportunity, but it has its properties, and we're real pleased with it. It's a good, sustainable material, and that's why we like it.
Charles, where can people find you if they have any more questions around PittMoss?
Well, you can contact me by email. It's Bethke Charles, BETHKECHARLES @gmail.com. I'm a independent consultant, actually, but I spend most of my time consulting with PittMoss, and that would be the way to go. Phone, I don't answer new phone numbers usually, but you can also go to PittMoss and they'll route things to me. And I want everybody to remember my favorite motto is, when you're green, you grow, and when you're ripe, you rot. So you have to keep investigating, learning, doing new things, and you'll always stay vibrant and valuable. But if you think you've got it all, you're going to lose. You're going to slowly just rot. So when you're green, you grow. When you're ripe, you rot.
My dad says, when you rest, you rust.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Same thing. Yes.
Guys, please remember to like, share, subscribe, and make sure to hit the notification button, and make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification button for more videos like this as we arise. Thank you so much, and have a great grow, everyone. Okay, so real quick, as we look at these products, we're going to jump down the very bottom where it says Open Sesame Beastie Bloom and Cha Ching. As you can see right here, that none of these products overlap. You use the Open Sesame first. They recommend a 1/4 teaspoon per gallon. Then you jump over to a Beastie Blooms. And remember, so right now you're in the first 3 weeks into flowering is when you use Open Sesame. And you got to think about it, right? They're marketing as Open Sesame, so starting those flowers. Beastie Blooms is to really get those flowers going as their marketing thought process. And so for there, you'll use the Beastie Blooms again at a 1/4 teaspoon per gallon for about 2 weeks. So weeks